Emma Huels. She obtained her bachelor's in psychology from the University of Missouri at St. Louis in 2016 and worked at the Washington University School of Medicine examining brain activity in patients with post-op delirium or those undergoing ECT for depression. Emma completed her doctoral training in neuroscience at the University of Michigan in 2024, where she studied the role of prefrontal cortex in arousal in rodents, as well as the effects of anesthetics, psychedelics, and shamanic practice on brain dynamics in rats and humans, presumably shamanic practice only in humans. Her research has been published in leading journals in the fields of anesthesiology and neuroscience. Emma's currently working as a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan with an MICHR postdoc award to study the effects of psychedelics on chronic pain in rodents. So thank you for joining us today, Emma, and we look forward to your talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. And also just thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it. And I'm very excited to be discussing the neural correlates of the shamanic state of consciousness. Can everybody see my screen okay? Okay. So I'll go ahead and get started. So shamanism is one of the world's oldest spiritual practices, with shamanic journeying having been used worldwide for physical, psychological, and spiritual healing since the Paleolithic era. And during the shamanic state of consciousness, a shaman in cases of indigenous tribes or shamanic practitioner in cases of neo-shamanism in the Western world enters an altered state of consciousness through pharmacologic or non-pharmacologic means. Pharmacologic means involve ingesting some sort of psychoactive substance, such as ayahuasca, whereas non-pharmacologic means usually entail listening to a slow, repetitive rhythm, such as a drum or rattle, and dancing to enter this altered state. And it's the job of the shamanic practitioner to use information gleaned during this altered state of consciousness to heal others. Additionally, there's significant anecdotal overlap between the shamanic state of consciousness and the psychedelic state. So for instance, shamanic practitioners may have feelings of insightfulness or bliss. They may have feelings of disembodiment, and they can even experience ego death, like in the psychedelic state. However, despite the widespread use of shamanic practice, as well as the similarity to the psychedelic state, very few studies have looked at brain activity during the shamanic state of consciousness, with just 2 fMRI and 1 EEG case study at the time of this paper. And so if we take a look at that previous literature, Huels et al. In 2016 looked at brain activity in 15 shamanic practitioners using fMRI and found increased activation in the posterior cingulate cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula, which overall suggested amplified activity in the control and default mode network. However, this study lacked naive controls, so they only looked at data from shamanic practitioners. And their control condition was actually drumming music. So they were looking at changes in brain activity during drumming music with and without trance in these shamanic practitioners. And the only time that a shamanic practitioner, in theory, should be listening to drumming music is when they're trying to enter the shamanic state of consciousness. So within that control condition, there's a chance that they may have reflexively entered the shamanic state of consciousness without wanting to. As for the other 2 studies, Rogerson et al. Looked at data in a single shamanic practitioner, again using fMRI, but this is just a case study, so again, it's hard to generalize those findings. And Fleur-Henry et al. Used EEG and found increased low and high beta activity during shamanic trance, but again, this was in a single subject. So we were interested to characterize the neural correlates of the shamanic state of consciousness using high-density EEG. And so we recruited 24 shamanic practitioners and 24 age and sex match controls. To be included as a shamanic practitioner, they had to have at least 5 years of experience and have completed at least 40 healing sessions over those 5 years. They had to have received training in at least 1 shamanic tradition and have previously used rhythmic drumming to enter the shamanic state of consciousness. They had to be able to enter a shamanic trance within 15 minutes of the start of the drumming, and they also couldn't have a history of epilepsy or traumatic brain injury. Now, our criteria to be included as a control were quite strict because we wanted to minimize the chance that these subjects could be entering a trance state during the drumming music. So to be included, control participants couldn't have any past interest or exposure in shamanic practice, even through the media. They couldn't have any experience in spiritual healing, meditation, or spiritual training. They couldn't have a history of trance or hypnosis or a history of hallucinogen, entheogen, or psychedelic drug use. They couldn't have a history of drumming or professional musicianship or listening to frequent drumming music, and they couldn't have any sort of major physical or psychological condition. Now, before I move on, I did just want to take a second to highlight the traditions that our shamanic practitioners cited as being important to their practice. So in this table, we have the shamanic practitioner ID on the left, and we have the traditions they cited as being important on the right. And I'm not going to go through this entire table, but I just kind of wanted to highlight the breadth of traditions that these shamanic practitioners are pulling from, meaning that we have a diverse set of shamanic practitioners for this study. So here you can see that the traditions range from Native American and Peruvian shamanism to, Tibetan and Siberian shamanism. On the day of the experiment, all subjects underwent high-density EEG recordings with 128 electrodes during periods of eye opening and eye closure. And this was followed by 3 different experimental conditions, which were cognitive testing, shamanic drumming, and classical music listening. Now, I'm not going to be discussing the cognitive test data today because the paper I'm presenting is more focused on changes in brain activity during the shamanic state of consciousness. So moving on to the drumming experiment, all subjects listened to a shamanic drumming recording by Michael Harner, and the shamanic practitioners were explicitly asked to enter the shamanic state of consciousness, whereas controls were asked to rest quietly with their eyes closed. Now, given that we know that listening to music can cause widespread changes in brain activity, we wanted to make sure we also had a proper control condition for the shamanic drumming. And so we designed a classical music experiment. And we chose classical music because it is both rhythmic and repetitive and lacks vocals, similar to drumming, but it hasn't been used by practitioners in the past for them to enter that shamanic state of consciousness. So all subjects listened to 2 different classical music pieces, which one was piano and the other one was piano and violin. And all subjects were asked to listen quietly with their eyes closed, and shamanic practitioners were explicitly asked to not enter the shamanic state of consciousness during that classical music experiment. Now, after the shamanic drumming and classical music experiments, all subjects answered a 66-item altered states of consciousness questionnaire, known as the ASC-OAV. And then they ended the study day with another EEG recording during their eyes open and their eye closure. And so the first thing I'm going to go over then is how we handled the altered states of consciousness questionnaire data. So as I mentioned, that was a 66-item questionnaire. And we pooled those data into 11 domains put forth by Studeris et al. In 2010. And these domains range from disembodiment and spiritual experience to complex imagery and anxiety. We then computed the mean and standard error of the mean for the percent of the theoretical scale maximum for each domain scored. And then we compared scores between shamanic practitioners and controls, as well as between drumming and classical music conditions. Additionally, given that anecdotal overlap I mentioned with the psychedelic state, we also compared the ASC scores of shamanic practitioners to ASC scores of individuals who had received ketamine, psilocybin, or MDMA in a previous study, specifically that Studeris et al. 2010 paper. And finally, we also conducted correlations to look at relationships between ASC scores in shamanic practitioners during drumming and EEG measures. Now, I did just want to briefly give an overview of EEG for those who may not be familiar. So EEG, or electroencephalography, measures electrical activity in the brain through the scalp. And this activity represents oscillations made by collections of neurons within the cortex. And while we don't know exactly which neurons are making these oscillations, we do have a rough idea of where these oscillations are coming from, such as the front of the brain or the back of the brain. And the more electrodes you have, the more certainty you have about where those oscillations are located. We can also divide these oscillations into different frequency bands, which are the delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma bands. And while we're still learning about why we have activity in these different frequencies, we do have an idea of when we expect oscillations within these different frequency bands to show up. So we know that delta activity, which is 1 to 4 hertz, shows up during non-REM sleep and general anesthesia. Theta activity has been associated with drowsiness and deep meditative states. Alpha activity emerges during eyes closed relaxed wakefulness in humans, and alpha activity is also known to decrease during the psychedelic state. Beta activity is associated with motor behavior and eyes open wakefulness. And then gamma activity is associated with consciousness, perception, and cognition. And I did want to say that the actual range of frequencies for these different frequency bands can vary from paper to paper, and this is kind of just a guide moving forward for today. So after we eliminated people who had missing data or noisy data or problems with data acquisition, we were left with 18 shamanic practitioners and 19 control participants. We filter the data from 1 to 45 hertz, and then we use those signals to compute 4 different measures within the frequency bands illustrated on the bottom right, which were the delta, theta, alpha 1 and 2, beta 1 and 2, and gamma bands. And these measures were EEG power, functional connectivity, measured by the weighted phase lag index, levels of complexity, which is a surrogate for neural signal diversity, and criticality, where we were measuring the variance of network synchronization. And while I'm not going to go into detail about how we computed each of these measures, I am going to give some background on what each of these measures means conceptually. Starting with EEG power. So EEG power is the amplitude of the signal squared, and broadly speaking, the more EEG power you have, the more activity there is at a given frequency. And this is often illustrated using a spectrogram, which shows the distribution of power across frequencies on the y-axis over time on the x-axis, where warmer colors represent greater power. We then have functional connectivity, which is looking at whether spatially distinct signals have a temporal relationship. And we do this by looking at the lead-lag relationship between 2 different electrodes. And so this is illustrated at the bottom right, where we have a red signal and a blue signal. Here we can see that the red signal looks like it's ahead of the blue signal. And so that means the red signal is leading and the blue signal is lagging. If the red signal continues to lead and the blue signal continues to lag, we'd say that these 2 signals have a temporal relationship and that they're functionally connected. However, if sometimes the red signal is leading and sometimes the blue signal is leading and they're switching back and forth, then we'd say that they don't have a temporal relationship and they're not functionally connected. Our next measure is levels of complexity, which is a surrogate for neural signal diversity that looks for the number of patterns within the neural signal. And this has been used across species during different perturbations in consciousness. So for instance, during depressed states of consciousness, such as coma and general anesthesia, neural signal diversity is known to be low, whereas during normal wakefulness, signal diversity is high. And importantly, we know that signal diversity increases during the psychedelic state above wakefulness levels, and that complexity values correlate with changes in experience during the psychedelic state, such that the higher the complexity, the richer the conscious experience. So again, given that overlap between the shamanic state of consciousness and the psychedelic state, we were interested to see how complexity was changing in our shamanic practitioners. Now, our last measure is going to be criticality. So criticality is a balanced state between order and disorder that exists ubiquitously across physical and biological systems. And it's accompanied by various functional benefits, such as large information storage, optimal information transmission, and a flexible response to stimuli. And previous studies suggest that brain functioning resides at a critical state, as illustrated on the right, and a loss of consciousness is associated with a loss of criticality, such as during sleep, anesthesia, and unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. Additionally, a recent study by Adesoy et al. Suggests that psychedelics actually increase criticality beyond waking levels. Now, to give you a better idea of what I mean about this balanced state of order and disorder, I want you to think of the liquid vapor critical point of water, where more ordered liquid states and more disordered gaseous states coexist. This is similar to criticality in the brain, where at a critical point during waking consciousness, both desynchronized and synchronized states exist, and there's kind of the switching between the two. So at a critical point, variance of the network synchronization should be maximal because we're switching between synchronization and desynchronization. And as we switch to more predominantly synchronized or desynchronized states, that variance should go down. All right, so now I'm going to actually get into the data of the paper, finally. So this is, I know, a busy slide, but I will walk you through it. So we're going to be starting with panel A on the left, where we're looking at the ASC scores of shamanic practitioners in purple and control participants in green. We have our ASC domains on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have the ASC scores. And so here we can see that shamanic practitioners have higher ASC scores in 8 of the 11 domains compared to control participants. So their scores are higher in the domains of complex imagery, experience of unity, spiritual experience, blissful state, disembodiment, insightfulness, elementary visual alterations, and changed meaning of percepts. Importantly, whenever we look at the ASC scores of shamanic practitioners and controls during classical music, they are essentially the same. So this means that shamanic practitioners are entering an altered state of consciousness, and it's specific to that shamanic drumming experiment. Now, as I mentioned, we wanted to know how the ASC scores of shamanic practitioners compared to healthy individuals who had received psychedelics. So on the right, we now have still shamanic practitioners in purple, and we now have MDMA in orange, ketamine in blue, and psilocybin in green. And here we can see that shamanic practitioners actually have higher scores than any of the three drugs in several domains. So specifically, shamanic practitioners have higher scores in the domains of complex imagery, experience of unity, spiritual experience, and insightfulness, whereas they have scores similar to different drugs depending on the domain. So for instance, their disembodiment scores are more similar to ketamine, and their blissful state scores are more similar to MDMA. And so again, shamanic practitioners are entering an altered state of consciousness that seems to be similar to, but distinct from any of these three psychedelic drugs. We're now going to move on to the EEG findings, starting with EEG power. So here we have a heat map illustrating a comparison of EEG power between shamanic practitioners and controls. So we have time on the x-axis, we have frequency on the y-axis, and we're looking at power during periods of eye closure, classical music, and shamanic drumming. And here, warmer colors represent greater power in shamanic practitioners, and cooler colors represent greater power in controls. And I've highlighted the gamma band, which is from 30 to 45 hertz, where we can see that there's warmer colors, meaning there's greater power in shamanic practitioners. And this is illustrated by the box plot on the right, where you can see that shamanic practitioners in purple have higher gamma power during shamanic drumming compared to those controls. And gamma power is positively correlated with the elementary visual alterations domain, meaning the higher gamma power, the higher ASC domain score. And so right away, this finding is interesting whenever we think about previous psychedelic literature, because as I mentioned earlier, when I was describing EEG, we know that alpha power is known to decrease during the psychedelic state. And here we're not actually seeing any changes in alpha power, and we're just seeing this increase in gamma power. And so this suggests right away that despite that anecdotal overlap, that there seem to be maybe some distinct changes in brain activity happening during the shamanic state of consciousness. So next we have functional connectivity measured by the weighted phase lag index. Again, we're comparing here between shamanic practitioners and controls. So warmer colors represent greater functional connectivity in shamanic practitioners, and cooler colors are greater functional connectivity in controls. I've highlighted the low alpha and low beta bands, where we actually see changes in both the shamanic drumming and classical music experiments. So we see here that low alpha connectivity is lower in shamanic practitioners compared to controls during both of these states, whereas it's higher in the low beta band in shamanic practitioners compared to controls, again, in the drumming and classical music experiments. And this highlights why we wanted to make sure that we did have a proper control condition, because we wanted to make sure that any changes that we saw were actually specific to shamanic drumming and not, say, specific to listening to some sort of auditory stimuli. And this also indicates that maybe there are some trait-related changes happening in shamanic practitioners. So a state-related change is something that's specific to a certain state, such as the shamanic state of consciousness, whereas this may be more trait-related change that is happening more longitudinally in shamanic practitioners as their practice grows. And so, for instance, this may just reflect a difference in how their brains are responding to auditory stimuli. However, in order to know this for sure, we would have to follow those shamanic practitioners before and after they start their practice to see if there are any long-term changes actually happening. So next we have levels of complexity, which again is a surrogate for neural signal diversity. Once again, warmer colors are greater complexity in shamanic practitioners, cooler colors are greater complexity in controls. And I've once again highlighted the gamma band, which is from 30 to 45 hertz. And now we see that there's a shift to cooler colors. So this means that complexity is decreased in shamanic practitioners compared to controls, which we can see illustrated in this box plot. And importantly, complexity is negatively correlated with the insightfulness domain. So that means the lower the complexity, the higher the score on that insightfulness domain. And this is another interesting finding when we think about the previous psychedelic literature, because as I mentioned earlier, we know that neural signal diversity increases during the psychedelic state, and here we're showing a decrease. Now, one possible explanation is that many of those previous studies look at broadband complexity. So they look at, say, from 1 to 45 hertz rather than looking at complexity within different frequency bands. However, when we looked at broadband complexity, we also didn't see a difference between shamanic practitioners and controls. So this, coupled with those changes in gamma power we saw earlier, really just suggests that there are distinct changes in brain activity happening during the shamanic state of consciousness compared to the psychedelic state. Okay, and lastly, we have criticality. So again, here we're looking at the variance in network synchronization. Once again, warmer colors represent greater criticality in shamanic practitioners, and cooler colors represent greater criticality in controls. Here I've highlighted the low beta, high beta, and the gamma bands, where we see various changes actually across the states. So starting with the low beta band, we see that shamanic practitioners have higher criticality compared to controls only during the shamanic drumming experiment. Whereas in the high beta band, we see that it's higher in shamanic practitioners during drumming and classical music. And in the gamma band, criticality is higher in shamanic practitioners across all three states. So once again, this highlights why we wanted to make sure that we had enough control conditions to make sure that we really were seeing changes that were specific to the shamanic state of consciousness. And this also reflects, again, maybe some state versus trait related changes. So we're only seeing criticality in the low gamma band be higher during shamanic drumming. And that's actually the score that is positively correlated with the complex imagery and elementary visual alterations domains, which makes sense since those low beta changes seem to be specific to the shamanic state of consciousness, whereas the other changes are happening across states. And to relate these findings a little bit more to some of the previous literature, I wanted to discuss a little bit about the entropic brain hypothesis. So according to the entropic brain hypothesis, brain functioning exists within a critical zone rather than at a critical point. And this zone is illustrated by these red dotted lines here. And psychedelics shift brain functioning to the upper end of that critical zone. And this shift in brain function is accompanied by an increased susceptibility to internal and external perturbations. In other words, we become more sensitive to our internal set and our external setting. And this leads to more diverse spatiotemporal brain patterns, and then in turn, a richer conscious experience. Now, as I mentioned, during shamanic drumming, we saw that low beta criticality also seemed to increase in these shamanic practitioners, which may reflect that shamanic practitioners also have brain functioning that is being shifted to the upper end of that critical zone. And in the high beta and gamma bands, we see that this may be happening long term. Specifically in the gamma band, we saw it across all three states. And this may reflect an increase in, again, more diverse spatiotemporal brain patterns and then a richer conscious experience. But as I mentioned, in order to know if there are actually longitudinal changes happening, we would have to follow these shamanic practitioners long term. And so in summary, this was the largest and most comprehensive neuroimaging study of the shamanic state of consciousness to date. And we found that shamanic trance was characterized by self-reported changes in experience, where shamanic practitioners reported similar and in some cases greater ASC scores compared to healthy individuals that had received psilocybin, ketamine, or MDMA. These self-reported changes in consciousness were accompanied by changes in a variety of EEG measures, several of which actually correlated with ASC domain scores. And we also found some possible trait-related changes in EEG measures, specifically with functional connectivity, and again, some of those criticality changes. And I think a big take-home point is that despite the similar phenomenology to the psychedelic state, we see these different EEG changes happening with the shamanic state of consciousness, which suggests that maybe shamanic trance and the psychedelic state are distinct states with shared traits. Now, the last thing I wanted to go over before we get into some questions is some future directions. So the first one being source localization. As I mentioned, we had 128 electrodes, which is a high enough density for us to try to localize where in the brain some of these signals are coming from. Another idea is to do EEG hyperscanning. And so EEG hyperscanning is whenever you record EEG signals from two individuals who are interacting at the same time. So for instance, here we have somebody who's playing the guitar, and then we have someone who's listening to the guitar being played. And so it'd be interesting in a future study to see what happens if we record brain activity from, say, a shamanic practitioner who is healing somebody and the individual who is being healed. I think another obvious question is, what does the brain activity look like in shamanic practitioners that use psychedelics to enter the shamanic state of consciousness? So here we've seen that during the shamanic state of consciousness induced by drumming, that there are definite differences from healthy individuals who have received psychedelics. But what is kind of that middle group of shamanic practitioners that have also ingested psychedelics? Is their brain activity more similar to healthy individuals who receive psychedelics? Is it more similar to shamanic practitioners during drumming? Or is it kind of a third brain state altogether? And as I had mentioned briefly earlier, myself and Rick Harris and some others are looking at changes in heart rate variability during the shamanic state of consciousness in a single subject. So kind of looking at some other physiological measures that can be associated with these non-pharmacologically induced altered states. And with that, I would like to thank everybody that helped with the shamanism project. This data was actually collected long before I got to graduate school in 2018. So I just wanted to thank everybody who helped make that project possible, as well as acknowledge my laboratory and the neuroscience graduate program, given that I did this work as a graduate student. And I'd like to give special thanks to the indigenous cultures, shamanic healers, and shamanic practitioners. Anytime that we're doing work with shamanic practice or psychedelics, I think it's important to acknowledge the cultures where those practices and medicines come from. I'd also like to acknowledge Kate Durda and Stephanie Tai, who helped us design this study in a way that was conducive to shamanic practitioners being able to enter the shamanic state of consciousness while we were studying them. I'd like to acknowledge my funding through the Mishar T32 postdoctoral training program, as well as the Center for Consciousness Science and the Chronic Pain and Fatigue Research Center for helping make this work possible. And with that, I thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Emma. That's very interesting. Please raise your hands for questions, and I have a few also. So Mungsen, why don't you go ahead first? Please post questions on the Q&A tab that we can then direct to the speaker. Go ahead,
I
Mungsen.
do have questions, but I actually accidentally clicked the raise hand because I was trying to give a applause emoji. I don't know where the applause emoji went. So great talk first. And then, yeah, I have several questions. Maybe I start with, I think the
Why
most
don't you pick one
curious thing.
question first, because we have several people lined up.
Oh yeah, I will start with one question. I would say if you're seeing this hypothesizing or seeing evidence for this moving towards criticality during this meditation, could you see that in the time series in the first 15 minutes when they're trying to enter into the shamanic state, or is there any time domain evidence for that as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the way that we analyze these data, which I think I would do it differently now, now that I'm a postdoc and have more experience, is that we were more looking at, we plotted it across the entire state, but we were more averaging across. I think that that's kind of actually another future direction, is to try to see throughout the actual 25 minutes of drumming, or for instance, throughout the classical music experiment, can you actually see these changes happening in real time? Obviously, temporal changes are a little bit harder to grasp, and you do need also enough data. So I imagine that one of the initial reasons that we chose to average was just to make sure we had enough clean data, especially because despite how much you ask people to sit still, they do not always sit still during EEG. But that's a great question. I'm sorry, I don't have an actual answer for you yet.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mungsen. Let me ask one question. I have two questions, but let's just start with one, the scientific question. One of your slides showed, of course, an increase. You mentioned an increase in gamma and an increase in several other rhythms, but there's, I think it was the first or second slide showing the heat map of the power spectrum, and I think that so it was back. Yes, I think back, or maybe it was it there? I think it was there or the next one. You also, yes.
This one?
No, the one just before that. Yes, that one. It seemed to me you have a dramatic decrease in theta rhythm activity. I don't recall that you commented on that.
Oh, you mean right here where the blue is?
Yeah, I guess you're calling that alpha.
Yeah, so we're calling it alpha. So that's and then so there we said that low alpha was I think 8 to 10 hertz. And so yes, just for the purposes of this study, it was an alpha, but it is on the cusp of that theta rhythm activity, which could be say like 4 to 8 hertz as well.
Yeah, sorry, I misread the graph. Sorry, my apologies.
You're fine.
Let's go on to Barry.
Yeah, so one thing that seemed to be missing in these graphs is location, brain location. I mean, you have at least 120 different electrodes. Are you averaging across the entire brain?
Yes, so we are averaging across the entire brain for this. That is another thing that I would do differently now if I was going to do the study again, is that I would actually look to see if there are any topographic changes happening. So I talked about source localization, but I think So to give context, I was a second-year graduate student when I started this project, and I was learning how to code and do EEG analysis and all these very exciting things that you do in graduate school. But I think that the additional questions I have are about kind of like topographic changes, source localization, things like that, especially because we did have 128 electrodes, which seems a little wasted to average across. But yeah, that's why there's no location here, is it's just averaged across all.
But can't you just reanalyze that data? I mean, isn't that raw data still available that you could do these things that you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. It's just a matter of time. It's just, yeah, it was
You don't
this,
have to run
yeah.
more subjects. Okay.
Yeah, no. I could definitely do that. This was actually part of a research rotation and wasn't in my dissertation lab. So it was just finding the additional time to do that. But it's, yeah, it's on my list of things to do. So good question.
Is the data, I don't know if, is the data released? Is it shareable, public, or is it like private?
So it's not publicly available as of now, but I'm pretty sure that our idea was that it would be available upon request, with like a data share agreement. So, but it's not like it's not like posted anywhere as of right now.
Okay, good.
Interesting.
We have one question from one of the listeners, Joey, I think it's Weifels. It says, I do not have much experience in EEG, so frequency band power is hard for me to interpret. Spiritual experiences are very rich, and it would be interesting if we can somehow represent that experience rather than only the neural correlates. And he asks, how feasible is it to use AI on the data to get some insight into these experiences, particularly how they feel or are seen by the shaman? Do you have any thoughts on that issue of using AI?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. So there was a lot of, like with most studies, you require more data than what makes it into the paper. And so one of the things that we did is we actually had these shamanic practitioners write out the details of their journey. So typically the shamanic state of consciousness, it's described as these practitioners are going on a journey because it kind of feels that way, that they're kind of traveling into these other spiritual worlds and they're having spiritual encounters, etc. So we have all of these written accounts of what these shamanic practitioners experience. So it would actually be interesting to like use AI to, if I was assuming, first you'd have to kind of transcribe those all into a digital space, which is a little bit hard because their handwriting was not always the neatest. But transcribing that into a digital space and then being able to see kind of, are there different like kind of themes that we see across them in terms of like a common theme that's in the shamanic state of consciousness is the use of power animals, which are kind of like in popular culture, we've heard them like say like spirit animals. So it would be interesting to see how often is the word power animal coming up, or how often are the different practices that can happen in shamanic journeys coming up, things like that. So that's probably my initial thought, is it would be used for a way to actually analyze qualitative data that really better reflects what's happening with these shamanic practitioners.
Yeah. I have one technical question that I didn't ask before, and that is one of your slides, I think it's either the one before or after this one, showed a very large increase in the gamma rhythm. And yes, I think it's that one. And as a matter of practice, it's the gamma rhythm is very heavily contaminated by muscle artifacts in the scalp and eyebrows and even eye movements. Do we have any way of controlling for that, or do you have any way of controlling for that, or is it possible that perhaps the practitioners just moved their eyes in different ways, or had different levels of tension in their scalps that would strongly influence the gamma band signal? So
my question would be, were you reviewer number 2? Just kidding. So that was one of the feedback that we got on our paper was there potential muscle contamination? Because we didn't actually record electromyography data. Again, this was collected, I think, back around 2015. But the answer that we had is it possible? Yes. We didn't really expect to see any differences in muscle contamination between shamanic practitioners and controls. Based on the people who collected this data, they said that they didn't really see any differences, but that does remain a potential possibility. And it's something that just initially wasn't controlled for, unfortunately.
Good.
I
Thanks.
think,
Barry, go ahead.
yeah, I think like this, given that the gamma power is greater, it's sort of more in a consistent way. And, because the muscle contamination is, I wouldn't expect it to be, that consistent over time.
Mhm.
So I think that, that certainly seems to reveal something that is, not caused by that. But I was also going to ask if did you do any filtering or correction for the artifacts before you looked at the power spectrum?
Yes. So yeah, so the data were cleaned for kind of noise. And again, like these were averaged across the entire, say, 25 minutes of drumming. And to your point about gamma as well, that was another thing that we were thinking is it's not surprising that we saw an increase in gamma with some of the previous literature. So I believe that there was a paper that was looking at EEG in Carmelite nuns who were recounting mystical experiences, and they found that there was an increase in gamma power. Compared to some other studies that have looked at EEG during, say, like prayer. And it seems like whenever there is this association with, say, visual imagery, mystical experiences, things like that, the gamma does seem to come up, as well as I think with some meditation studies versus just like doing spiritual practices that could potentially be calming. So that's the other reason that it wasn't shocking that we saw this gamma activity. And as you said, it doesn't seem to look like typical artifacts you see in the EEG.
Great, thank you. Barry, and then Mungsun?
Yeah, well, just on this point about contamination, if you were looking at the gamma in different locations, some locations are going to be more susceptible to muscle artifacts. So if you can look at gamma instead of just averaging across the whole brain, you know what I'm saying.
No, that's a great point. Like if we looked at like the temporal electrodes, which are my least favorite electrodes out of all of them, that would also help answer that question. That's a great point.
Okay, right. Mungsun?
Yeah, I was about to mention there is this I think I was thinking about how different musically is the classical music piece with the drumming piece, because just forgive my ignorance, I don't know how the drumming part actually work in the shamanic meditation. There are 40 hertz auditory evoked, auditory induced gamma oscillation that's often observed for repeated auditory stimuli with an ABBA or something like that. And interestingly, it has been sort of damaged if people have like schizophrenia. So with people have problem with hallucination, people actually have lower this 40 hertz evoked activity. I was just thinking about this is kind of interesting because you're thinking about we're talking about a controlled, right, altered state of consciousness versus the uncontrolled state of consciousness. Yeah, but if the thing is that the evoked response is also in the temporal cortex, so you can get away with completely with artifact removal. But yeah.
No,
Yeah,
that's a
I
really
don't think it looks like an artifact to me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. So one of the things, so I should say, the shamanic drumming, it's very rhythmic. It's like a steady, like say, 4 hertz type rhythm. So one of the things that one of the authors of the paper, Anshul Lee, he's a physicist by training, and so one of the things that he actually is interested in is the idea of sensory entrainment. So we haven't had a good way to do this, but the idea, can we actually see what the rhythm is from the drumming music, and then see, are we seeing anything that corresponds to that rhythm within the EEG signals? So yeah, I will say that while classical music is repetitive, it's not going to be quite the same as this rhythmic drumming. The drumming also, you can find it on Spotify, actually. It is, it's faster than I would expect. So it's not like a slow rhythm. It's like, I mean, 4 hertz is pretty consistent. And it is one that actually some control subjects would say gives them anxiety, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, so like, that's a great question. I would say classical music it's a better control because again, we want to make sure there was no chance the shamanic practitioners would enter a trance state. But I do wonder if there is a different type of repeated rhythm that would be a way that you could have a control for that potential like sensory entrainment idea.
Yeah, just for that entrainment idea, I think it would be really, really fun if you do a frequency ramping, especially you have this idea of criticality. In principle, theoretically, if this is really shifting towards phase transition or criticality, you should be able to see a gradual approximation of the frequency of with the shamanic rhythm that they're used to, you might actually induce something, a transition in that way. It's just a fun thought. Thank you for your answer.
It's a great idea. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Michael Bachman. Says, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. What was the frequency of the drumming? I think you've answered that. You said it was 4, is that right?
Yeah, it's around 4 hertz. And if anybody would like to hear it, it's in the paper, but I can also send the link to it to one of you if you guys want to share it with everybody, so that can give them an idea of what it sounds like.
Yeah, I can put the link to the paper in the chat right now, or okay. And did you try different types of drums and drumming rhythms? And I'm guessing not. Is that correct?
No. So the way that was done is that there was I think it's a 30-minute piece. It's called 30-minute from drumming with callback. And I think that they took the initial 15 minutes and then they took the middle 10 minutes and then kind of spliced them together to make it a drumming piece. But with shamanic drumming, it'll be either consistently drumming, or you might have drumming with bells and rattles as well. So it kind of depends on the shamanic practitioner, what type of music they would like to listen to or what they're used to.
Sure, it's different in different traditions. Okay, and I put the link to the paper, at least the PubMed version of the paper, in the chat. You can also get the Frontiers version. I suppose both would have the recording. But okay, Barry, question, and then we should probably wrap up soon.
Sure, I have lots of questions. So, for instance, I was very interested in the correlation between the subjective measure of ASC and actual, brain activity. That's very supportive. But did you do that correlation separately for controls and separately for the shamanic people, or across the both, groups?
Yes. So that's actually a great point. So we only did it for basically if a measure was specific to the shamanic state of consciousness. We were looking for measures that were the ASC domain scores that were different from shamanic practitioners and controls. Those were the ones that we correlated with the ASC measures, or the EEG measures, because we wanted to make sure that there's a lot of comparisons going on, and you can't, and with the amount of tests we were doing, we would just be underpowered. So we didn't do it for the control subjects. But I will actually bring up an interesting point with the question about controls. One of the questions we got whenever we were submitting this paper was that the shamanic practitioners were listening to, they're in an active brain state during the shamanic state of consciousness, whereas the control subjects were kind of passive. They were just listening quietly. And so they were wondering if there was a chance that the controls could have also, if that's kind of a contamination. And there was actually a previous paper that asked if you give controls a direction to enter a trance state during shamanic drumming, are they able to? And do they have similar changes in brain activity? And the answer was no. So they actually had some, I think, decreases in alpha activity and increases in delta. So they said maybe giving them instruction made them more relaxed, but you weren't seeing these same types of changes in brain activity. So it also makes sense that they weren't having the same types of changes in experience. And like I said, I think really most of them just said maybe the drumming made them a little bit anxious in the beginning. So it was a long answer, sorry.
Oh, no, it's good. It would sort of be interesting to know what kind of training, what daily meditation, do they just listen to drumming music on a daily basis and enter the state? I'm just kind of interested in the practice of how this works. If you could send us something about that, that would be interesting. But my final question, if I, because it's not noon, it's not 1 o'clock yet, is about the source localization slide. Because you didn't have, it seemed like you didn't feel you had time to mention any comment about it. But yeah, so
that's not, we didn't do the source localization. That's a future direction we want to do, is source localization. That is not data that we have done. That's,
okay. Well,
that's still to do. So I wanted,
answer.
yes, I was so sorry to let you down on that front.
Right, it's another thing to do. It's such a rich data set.
Yes, indeed. So that is one that one of our collaborators, that several collaborators have really been asking to do. And now that I am a postdoc and I'm not doing my dissertation, it's something that's actually on the table. So
such an excellent presentation, just so well done, really.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma.
Yes.
Glad you could join us. And
I'll stop the recording.